Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Subcommittee on Government Operations, and this is a subcommittee of the House Government Oversight and Reform Committee for this hearing on October 14th. First of all, thank my ranking member, Mr. Conley, for being here and for our negotiating and working together to make this hearing a reality, which hasn't been a very simple process. We had planned to conduct this hearing, I think, at least 2 times before. One time they eliminated votes that week and members didn't return. Another time we had it scheduled, and this was a convenient time for this hearing. And also we have tried to conduct as many oversight hearings as we can. I think it's an important responsibility, not only of this committee, but the Congress, to see how taxpayer dollars are expended. So first, I thank the ranking member for his forbearance and also cooperation in making this, this campaign, in this campaign season, top priority, the interest of the American people and the taxpayers who pay the bill. The title of the hearing today is involves gym memberships, gift cards, hair salons, and the purpose is actually examining the misuse of government supplied credit cards. So as we start this hearing, we always, Mr. Issa starts the hearing and cites a little principle statement of the purpose of our hearings and this committee and subcommittee. There are appropriators in Congress and there are authorizers in Congress who write legislation. Everything outside the Constitution is created by law or funded by Congress. Early on, in about 1808, the Founding Fathers created the forebearer of this committee, and that's the Government Reform and Oversight Committee today. And we've had various names of that purpose, but it's one of the few governments that I know on the planet that has additional check on how money is expended for programs that are authorized by government. And it is an important responsibility because the public has the right to know how their money is spent. It's our duty to see that that money is properly spent. So with that little opening statement of our principles and purpose of the committee, I want to again turn to the order of business, which will be opening statements from myself, the ranking member, Mr. Conley. Then we'll recognize the witnesses that we have. We have 5 witnesses today. And then we'll proceed with questions. Appreciate our witnesses appearing. Again, the purpose of the whole hearing is to look at the way credit cards and micro purchases, small purchases, are made. We formed a program several years back, I think it's actually 30 years back, to allow the use of credit cards. And the program allows, again, a government-issued credit card for small purposes. This program is administered by GSA, and actually we did a hearing prior to 2012 looking at some of the abuses and misuse of credit cards in anticipation of trying to improve that process. The program gives Federal departments and agencies and employees the flexibility for these small purchases, which are currently capped at $3,000. One of the key benefits of this program, the credit card program, is it allows the government to avoid burdensome administrative costs and a lot of paperwork. But unfortunately, while it does simplify the process and it does save money, it does have some serious drawbacks. In 2008, the Government Accountability Office published a report that found internal control weaknesses in agency purchase card programs exposed the Federal Government to fraud, waste, abuse, and also loss of assets, and that's quoted from that report. Congress responded to this and some other very serious audit findings by passing a bill that some of us were involved in 2012 that was called Government Charge Card Abuse Prevention Act of 2012. And this hearing is actually a follow-up to see what's taken place since we passed that law and how effective it has been. This act, among other things, required tighter controls and also allowed departments and agencies to fire employees who engage in fraudulent use when using a government card to make purchases. It also directs the Inspectors General to engage in annual reviews of the program. We're going to highlight and focus on one of those reviews in this hearing today. This act does not apply to the Department of Defense. However, today we've invited one representative of the military, the Air Force, to testify about how they avoid fraud in the agency's purchase card program. We also will hear from the Air Force about whether they need a statute like we have the Government Charge Card Abuse Prevention Act, which again we passed in 2012, but exempted the DOD. And we will question as to whether we think that type of law needs to be imposed on DOD. Today, I expect to hear from some of the civilian agencies about the effectiveness of the Act. And one of the reports that we're going to cover here, we have actually, and this is part of what this hearing is called for, as back in March, and again, we've had a delay in conducting this hearing, but in March, the Office of Inspector General of EPA issued this report entitled Ineffective Oversight of Purchased Credit Cards Results in Inappropriate Purchases at EPA. And we'll hear from EPA IG in that regard. We'll find from that report that EPA did not provide effective controls required by the 2012 law. The IG found that more than half the credit card purchases sampled, now listen to this, they took a sampling, but half of those that were sampled were either prohibited, improper, or erroneous purchases. In fact, again in that report, that's quite startling, but 94% of the review, of their review of the EPA transactions were not in compliance with EPA, and this is their words, not in compliance with EPA policies according to the law. We have evidence that DHS spent $12,000 all purchases and charges at one particular coffee shop in California. And I got a little Starbucks here. We're not supposed to show any labels, but they bought $12,000 worth of Starbucks coffee at this California location in 2013. Now, we've been looking, this is just the Coast Guard in that one Starbucks, pretty heavy bill with those credit cards. But we now are up to more than $31,000 that DHS spent at that Starbucks, again looking at different reports that have been filed. A recent report suggests that the Bureau of Land Management used government charge cards to buy almost $800,000 in gift cards. This is another recent report, and this is the Office of Inspector General, the U.S. Department of Interior. So we have another agency that, again, has gone wild with these micro charge card purchases. The Bureau is not with us today, but we intend to follow up with them, with that agency and any others that we see abuses. Another example of abuses in the Department of Labor, the Inspector General Office is with us today to discuss serious abuses they found when their offices audited the Job Corps program. Now, let me focus on this report for just a moment, because it's a model for how an IG should operate and interact with the department over which it has oversight. The Labor Department Office of Inspector General received a request for an audit and a review of the Job Corps in my home state and in the city of Miami from the Department of Labor Management. The request related to allegations that the Miami office was abusing this credit card purchase program. The OIG conducted an audit and found that there were indeed individuals using government prepaid debit cards for their own personal gain at that Miami office, and they also found similar abuses across the U.S. Specific to Miami, the cards were used for nearly $100,000 worth of trips to the hair salon, clothing stores, and payment of personal phone bills. As a result of the OIG's work, again, the Department of Labor, OIG, and through their work, 3 Miami employees were terminated and referred to authorities, and 2 other employees resigned. This demonstrates how the system should work, and we gave some pretty strong authority in that 2012 law to act. However, again, the Department of Defense is not covered by the Act, but it's actually, I think, the government's largest purchaser, and we have done some preliminary review and found some serious abuses in DOD that need to be addressed. This committee has examined similar instances of abuse of taxpayer dollars. In 2012, the Oversight Committee and Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which I chaired at the time, held hearings on the infamous GSA Las Vegas conference. On September 25th, that's not too many days ago, Jeff Neely, the now infamous GSA employee responsible for organizing the extravagant Las Vegas conference that caught everybody's eye. I think we had a picture of him. Yeah, everybody recalls this guy, Jerry, thumbing his nose at us in a hot tub. But it took all that time to document and go after the falsely filed travel vouchers and statements that Mr. Neely had made. Mr. Neely represented to GSA on several instances that his travel was for official purposes, and many of Mr. Neely's purported business trips were, as we saw, and they identified were for pleasure. The individuals in Miami and Mr. Neely are the rare, let me say rare, bad examples of Federal workers in our Federal workplace. The vast majority of Federal employees are honest and hard-working, dedicated individuals. But I hope today's hearing will serve us as both the reminder that we need to do a better job monitoring this credit card program, and also act as a potential deterrent to deter bad actors. Make no mistake, Congress, the Inspector Generals, your managers, and all of us in Congress will hold offenders accountable. The American people work hard, send their taxpayer dollars to Washington, and they expect and they deserve to have accountability and responsible use of their tax dollars here. If the 2012 law needs additional reform, we will reform it. If agencies fail to uphold the law, we will hold them accountable. Congress needs to be informed so that we can take the appropriate action, and I'm hoping this hearing will achieve that goal. Today we'll be sending, and again, this is not Republican, Democrat, political issue. This is a fiscal responsibility and proper conduct and operations of our Federal government and agencies. And Mr. Conley has worked in lockstep, has never faltered a moment in assisting in this effort to go after, again, people who abuse the law. He's joining me today in sending a letter to GAO requesting an update to the audits and investigations they have previously conducted on the purchase credit card fraud. Mr. Conley has signed on to this request, so it's from both of us. And without objection, a copy of that letter will be made part of the record, so ordered without objection. But I want to thank, again, Mr. Conley for his steadfast commitment to, again, going after abuses where we see it, his strong support of Federal employees, and we try to make certain that they're rewarded and recognized, but also, while this is a small, rather quiet hearing today, it's important, and I thank him for his commitment. I thank the witnesses for their participation and look forward to their testimony. And let me recognize the distinguished ranking member from the nearby state of Virginia, Mr. Conley. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Micah, and thank you for the 2 years we've had the opportunity to work together. We have absolutely worked on a bipartisan basis on our agenda for this subcommittee, and I appreciate that, the commitment of your staff and my staff to making that happen. It's a model for how I think the broader committee and committee structure in Congress can work. We don't pretend we don't have disagreements, but we have been able to find common ground, and I really appreciate your leadership in that regard and your friendship. Thank you, Chairman Micah. And by the way, I think we're the only show in town today.
A small but important activity, and thank you again for attending.
I was greeting our panel and telling them how lucky they were to be part of the only show in town here in the Hill. The subcommittee is addressing an issue of Federal financial management that boasts broad bipartisan agreement over the desired outcomes, namely dramatically reducing incidents of waste, fraud, and abuse involving government charge cards, while ensuring agencies are identifying abusers and taking appropriate enforcement actions to deter such conduct. I've long believed that to build trust in public institutions, it's absolutely vital for public servants to conduct themselves in a manner that reduces both real and perceived risks of such waste, fraud, and abuse. When I served on the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors and as its chairman for 5 years, I made it the policy of my office never to use or possess a purchase card, which not only eliminated any risk of waste, fraud, and abuse, but also carried considerable value with respect to enhancing our community's trust in its local government, a vital characteristic that may be difficult to quantify, but I think is absolutely essential for good government. I don't necessarily subscribe to that model for the entire Federal government, but it has something to commend it. Ensuring that agencies actually implement corrective actions in response to the IG recommendations is a critically important facet of congressional oversight, and I look forward to receiving a progress update this afternoon. In addition to reviewing those 3 IG reports, I also look forward to learning more about how the Air Force is improving its charge card program after examining one specific $24,000 procurement, of which surely must be high-quality, commercial-grade espresso machines intended to serve thousands of service members on a daily basis. Although this acquisition was certainly not a small dollar charge card purchase, it recently garnered negative press attention due to the cost alone, and I hope our Air Force witness can provide us with necessary context to fully understand why the purchase was made for these machines and the cost associated with it. We must also examine the effectiveness of our own efforts here in Congress, and I look forward to reviewing the implementation of the Bipartisan Government Charge Card Abuse Prevention Act of 2012, which you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, which the Oversight Committee considered and favorably reported back in 2011, prior to its unanimous passage by Congress and enactment late in 2012. Finally, it is also important that our subcommittee provide context to ensure that we do not throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. Moving beyond specific cases of abuse that certainly make my own blood boil, to truly safeguard taxpayer dollars, one must understand that evidence derived from nearly 16 years of experience with Federal charge card programs seems to indicate that in authorizing frontline Federal employees to use credit cards to make micro purchases, Congress actually facilitated a more efficient procurement system that continues to achieve actual cost savings and cost avoidances that outstrip the estimated cost associated with obviously unacceptable incidents of charge cards abuse. According to the GSA, taxpayers benefit from charge card programs because they cost agencies nothing to obtain charge card services, and the use of the cards has generated more than $1 billion in gross agency rebates over the past decade alone, resulting from contractual provisions requiring the credit card companies to pay rebates, also known as refunds, to agencies based on the amounts charged to the cards. It is vital we not overreact in response to outrageous but isolated incidents of abuse with broad one-size-fits-all restrictions that revert our Federal procurement system back to the pre-1998 era, which featured higher administrative burdens and more cumbersome bureaucracy that resulted from agencies being unable to utilize government charge cards as a low-cost method to streamline acquisition. As the Office of Management and Budget noted in a government-wide memorandum reminding agencies of the obligations to consider small businesses when making micro-purchases, the majority of the approximately 260,000 purchase cards in circulation are in the hands of frontline civil servants to efficiently support mission delivery. To be clear, I am not minimizing the findings of numerous Government Accountability Office reports and the IG audits in front of us over the last decade that identified inadequate and inconsistent controls across Federal agencies with respect to both purchase and travel cards. In fact, that is one of the reasons I certainly enthusiastically supported the Government Charge Card Abuse Prevention Act. I further recognize that while Congress codified the majority of GAO's recommendations in passing that bill, as the findings of DHS, DOL, and EPA reveal, much more work remains to be done. And I certainly am prepared to join with you, Mr. Chairman, in inking additional legislative remedy if that is what is required. As the GS conference scandal demonstrated, the nature of misconduct often results in consequences that go far beyond the pure dollars wasted. For example, in my district, constituents and industry often raise concerns that in our response to that outrageous 800,000 boondoggle, the Federal Government may have unintentionally swung the pendulum too much in the other direction, preventing effective communication between public and private sectors, inhibiting interagency coordination, and perhaps even having a chilling effect on the innovation that occurs from networking. The bottom line is that we cannot rest until we have significantly enhanced internal control standards to lessen the risk of waste, fraud, and abuse. For the disgraced minority of those who abuse government charge cards, we must ensure that the consequences are consistently implemented and appropriate in relation to the severity of the abuse. It is absolutely vital that we enhance enforcement to ensure justice is carried out and to ensure credibility on the part of the Federal Government and with its taxpayers, and also do right by the vast majority of Federal employees who, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, are hardworking and honest civil servants. With that, I look forward to this hearing and look forward to our testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member, Mr. Conley, for his statement, and all members may have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record. And now let me turn to recognize our panel. I'll introduce them. First, we have Janet Casper, and Janet Casper is the Director of Contracts and Assistance Agreements Audits in the Office of Inspector General at the U.S. EPA. Mr. Elliott Lewis is the Assistant Inspector General for Audits at the U.S. Department of Labor. Ms. Ann Richards is the Assistant Inspector General for Audits at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Mr. John Lyle is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Contracting at the United States Air Force. And Mr. H.L. Larry is the Deputy Director of Air Force Services at the United States Air Force. I thank all of the witnesses and welcome them today. I don't know if you've come before our committee or subcommittee before, but this is an Investigations and Oversight Committee of Congress. And in accordance with our rules, we do swear in our witnesses. So if you'll please stand, I'll administer the oath. Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before this subcommittee of Congress is the whole truth and nothing but the truth? All of the witnesses, the record will reflect answered in the affirmative. And again, I welcome you. Thank you for coming today. Of course, we don't have as many members today since we're not voting, but we try to limit you to 5 minutes, which if you have to go a little bit over, I think today would be okay. We do have copies of your statements that were prepared and submitted to the committee, which will be made of a part of the record without objection, so ordered. So you can, again, try to make some major points to the panel this afternoon. And we will run the clock, but again, we'll try to give you as much leeway as possible. And then we'll go through all of the 5 witnesses, and then Mr. Conley and I will direct questions to the witnesses. So with that, first let me recognize, and for the purpose of her testimony, Janet Casper, Director of Contract and Assistant Agreement Audits at the U.S. Inspector General's Office of EPA. Welcome, and you're recognized. Pull the mic up, too, as you all of you testify so we can hear you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mica, Ranking Member Conley, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to appear before you today. The Government Purchase Card Program was established over 30 years ago to streamline the federal acquisition process by providing a low-cost, efficient vehicle for attaining goods and services. The Government Charge Card Abuse Prevention Act of 2012, which is designed to prevent recurring waste, fraud, and abuse of government purchase cards. In 2012, EPA had 2,071 employees who were assigned purchase cards. Of those, more than half were active cardholders who transacted $29 million in purchases. In addition, EPA had 1,000 checks writers totaling more than $500,000. The Charge Card Abuse Prevention Act of 2012 states that the Inspector General is to conduct periodic assessments of the agency's purchase card program to identify risk of illegal, improper, or erroneous payments. In March 2014, the EPA OIG issued a report on EPA's management of purchase cards. The objective of the audit was to determine whether EPA's use of purchase cards, whether EPA has sufficient controls to identify potentially illegal, improper, and erroneous use of purchase cards. Overall, we found that EPA's oversight is not effective to ensure purchase card holders and approving officials comply with internal controls. Of $152,602 in transactions we sampled, we found $79,254 of prohibited, improper, and erroneous purchases. The improprieties range from missing approvals to more serious issues of using cards for prohibited purchases. Specifically, the internal control oversight issues we identified in one or more transactions included cardholders did not verify receipt of purchase items, cardholders did not obtain approval prior to making purchases, cardholders and approvers did not apply closer scrutiny to transactions such as clothing, entertainment, and light refreshments. There were some transactions that, in our opinion, were more egregious than others. EPA policies allow for the purchase of light refreshments for an award recognition ceremony. For one transaction we reviewed, EPA provided 4 different appetizers, chicken tenderloin, fresh fruit, pasta salad, cookies, soft drinks, and punch, much more than just light refreshments. The total cost of the food was $2,900. In 13 of 80 transactions we reviewed, cardholders did not follow requirements related to restricted transactions. For example, in 3 instances, cardholders who were not acquisition professionals purchased gym memberships that required prepayment of services totaling $2,867. 2 of these purchases were for family memberships, not just the EPA employee. Our audit found the approving officials did not review purchase logs for 14 of the 80 transactions. For one transaction, the approving official incorrectly assumed that since he had pre-approved the purchase, he did not have to review the purchase card log quarterly. Consequently, he was unaware that the funder and cardholder amended his prior approval to purchase an additional item for $805 for personal use. In conclusion, 75 of 80 reviewed transactions were not in compliance with EPA policies. These transactions were undetected because EPA approving officials and purchase card team. Improved purchase card oversight potentially saves money by reducing prohibited, improper, and erroneous purchases, which would be especially beneficial in the current budget environment. To improve transparency, during the past year, the OIG has started to publish reports on its own compliance with laws, regulations, and procedures. As part of this effort, the OIG initiated a detailed audit of its own internal controls over purchase cards. We plan to make that report public very soon. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared statement. I would like to thank this subcommittee for your continuing support for the OIG's mission and your robust interest in our work. I would be pleased to answer any questions you or the subcommittee members may have.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Casper. And we'll now turn to Mr. Elliott Lewis, Assistant Inspector General for Audits, Office of Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Labor. Welcome, and you're recognized, sir.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mica, Ranking Member Connolly. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our April 2014 audit that identified wasteful spending due to the misuse and mismanagement of prepaid debit cards and government travel cards in the Job Corps program. Our audit concluded that more than $900,000 of government funds were misused or wasted because Job Corps lacked basic internal controls over prepaid debit cards and centrally billed government travel cards used to pay for student travel. The $1.7 billion Job Corps program provides residential and non-residential education, training, and support services to approximately 60,000 disadvantaged at-risk youths aged 16 to 24 at 125 Job Corps centers nationwide. Job Corps student travel costs more than $20 million annually. Job Corps pays student travel expenses for initial visits, admissions, transfers, and breaks. The Department referred allegations it received relating to misuse of debit cards at one of its centers. We conducted an audit to determine whether student travel expenses claimed by Job Corps centers were allowable. In May of 2009, Job Corps centers began issuing prepaid debit cards to students rather than cash, so students could pay for checked baggage charges incurred during travel. Job Corps later expanded the use of cards to pay for student meals while in transit. During our audit, we reviewed the records for nearly 18,000 cards with a total value of $600,000 to determine whether they complied with Federal and DOL travel rules. We found that approximately 35% of the cards were misused to purchase items such as consumer electronics, clothing, wireless telephone service, and various online purchases. These improper purchases occurred at 98 of the 104 centers reviewed. At the Miami Center alone, over 1,800 cards were misused to make improper purchases totaling more than $96,000. The operator at the Miami Center generally agreed with our results and terminated 3 employees while 2 others resigned. Job Corps and most of the other centers we reviewed acknowledged that prepaid debit cards had been used to make more than 6,000 improper purchases, totaling almost $250,000. However, we could not always determine who made these purchases because the centers did not maintain adequate control over the cards. Our audit also found that even if the debit cards were properly used, they were not cost-effective. We found Job Corps paid more than $100,000 in merchant fees for the 18,000 prepaid debit cards purchased by centers from December of 2009 to March of 2013. In addition, completely unused cards could be returned for a refund, but partially used cards could not. We identified about 4,000 cards with partially remaining balances totaling almost $30,000. Job Corps and its center operators lacked basic internal controls over these cards. Moreover, Job Corps did not place sufficient emphasis on establishing processes for centers to distribute and monitor the cards, nor did Job Corps monitor centers' use of the cards to ensure charges were allowable, necessary, and reasonable. We also reviewed Job Corps centers' use of government-issued travel cards to pay for student travel. Job Corps centers were required to use a government travel card in order to obtain contracted airfares. We found many instances where cards were canceled or suspended because Job Corps had not ensured that the card accounts were paid. When centers were unable to use their government travel cards, they were forced to purchase commercial airfares, which were often 50% or more above the government fare. Travel card suspensions for the Boston region alone cost Job Corps over $400,000, the cost savings lost from paying commercial airfares. As a result of our audit, we made several recommendations for Job Corps to improve internal controls, processes, and oversight. We also recommended Job Corps take corrective action to ensure that government travel cards are not suspended or canceled. The Department responded that it has taken steps to address these issues and will take additional actions to improve the oversight of Job Corps student travel. The Department stated it has eliminated the use of the prepaid debit cards. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, it is important that Job Corps ensure that all of its funds are spent efficiently and effectively in support of the program. Although travel is not the largest of Job Corps' costs, the results of this audit demonstrate that Job Corps can do more to ensure its travel funds are spent wisely. As with all our reports, we will follow up on the Department's actions in response to our recommendations. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I would be pleased to answer any questions that you or any members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis, and we'll hold questions. As I said, we'll now turn to Ann Richards, and she's the Assistant Inspector General for Audits at the Office of Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Mica, Ranking Member Connolly. Thank you for inviting me to discuss our work related to DHS's Purchase Card Program. My testimony today will focus on our efforts to assess the program and recommend ways to decrease the inherent risk of purchase card use, as well as the Department's progress in implementing those recommendations. In fiscal year 2013, DHS purchase card holders spent about $439 million in over 925 million purchase card transactions, placing the Department among the top purchase card users in the Federal Government. When used properly, purchase cards decrease administrative costs, increase procurement efficiency, and provide an audit trail. Purchase cards are a low-cost procurement and payment mechanism that eliminates the need for paper purchase orders and expedites vendor payments. The inherent or natural risk of purchase card misuse is greater because of the number of cardholders and the low-dollar, decentralized actions, which are subject to fewer reviews and controls. But this increased risk was purposely accepted to reap the benefits of a simplified procurement process, that is, less cost and quicker response. Over the last decade, the DHS OIG and GAO have conducted several audits and investigations addressing the Department's use of purchase cards. Based on that work, we've reported that a weak control environment and breakdowns in key controls have exposed DHS to purchase card fraud and abuse. In short, purchase card guidance was inconsistent, and inadequate staffing, insufficient training, and ineffective monitoring also contributed to the weak control environment. DHS has agreed with our recommendations and taken actions to improve its control environment. To this end, DHS has taken actions to ensure cardholders and approving officials have required training, cardholders do not exceed single purchase limits or monthly limits without appropriate justification, and that cardholders comply with documentation requirements and approvals before making purchases. DHS has also taken steps to improve its post-payment audit process to include more targeted reviews of potentially questionable transactions, such as those transactions taking place at retail stores, ATMs, or restaurants. In our audits, we also identified numerous examples of potentially fraudulent, improper, and abusive or questionable transactions. Those transactions were subsequently individually reviewed, and appropriate corrective actions were taken when necessary. In January of this year, we reported that DHS had an adequate internal control framework to manage its purchase card program, but that the Department needed to continue improving its compliance with regulations and implementing its internal controls. In other words, the internal control design is strong, but more vigorous adherence to the design is still needed. Additionally, new controls are in place based on the Government Charge Card Abuse Prevention Act of 2012, including the periodic risk assessments to be conducted by our office and an annual reporting requirement on the state of charge card internal controls and the status of any outstanding audit recommendations. Pursuant to that legislation and the results of our 2013 risk assessment, we are currently conducting a purchase card audit to determine whether the Department has made progress in improving its implementation of internal controls. This audit includes evaluating a sample of transactions to determine if the internal controls are working as designed. We plan to publish a report on this audit in early 2015. Consistent application of controls and vigilant oversight by management minimize fraudulent, improper, abusive, or questionable purchase card usage, but the inherent risks cannot be eliminated. Nevertheless, purchase cards give the government flexibility in making purchases and save money on transaction processing. The Department's actions provide reasonable assurance that potential fraud, waste, and abuse are minimized, while the value and benefit of simplified procurements using purchase cards have been maximized. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared statement. I welcome any questions you or the ranking member may have.
Thank you, Ms. Richards, and then we will get back to you with questions. Turn to our next witness, Mr. John Lyle. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Contracting at the U.S. Air Force. Welcome, sir, and you are recognized.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Mica and Ranking Member Connolly, for the opportunity to testify this afternoon. Because I've submitted my complete testimony for the record, and based on your request, I will provide a brief summary of my testimony. First and foremost, we in the Air Force are committed towards ensuring proper spending controls are effectively used in the government-wide purchase card program, referred to as GPC. In summary, when used in place of written purchase orders, the GPC allows us to appreciably reduce delinquent payment interest charges, save $70 per transaction in administrative costs, and obtain rebates that further our ability to execute the mission. In fiscal year 2013, Air Force units saved $105 million on 1.5 million transactions and received $14.7 million in rebates on total expenditures of $1.2 billion. Through a variety of tried and true systemic and human controls, we are confidently able to monitor the activities of over 26,000 cardholders spread across 10 Air Force major commands, 4 field operating agencies, and 3 direct reporting units, both domestic and overseas. In accomplishing this, we strongly endeavor to work with the Office of Secretary of Defense's Office of Defense Procurement and Acquisition Policy and our industry partners at U.S. Bank and Visa to augment the field's ability to protect taxpayer dollars against fraud, waste, abuse, and misuse. The Air Force leads the Department of Defense with 96% of cardholders registered in the Purchase Card Online, or PCOLS, system. PCOLS is an automated tool that audits 100% of all GPC transactions. It flags 3% of the high-risk transactions for manual audit. Since 2002, the Air Force Audit Agency has conducted 8 audits on the GPC program, with 2 of the most recent occurring in 2012 and 2013. These audits, used in conjunction with other internal control measures like data mining reports, ad hoc and scheduled inspections, and a host of checks and balances that separate the roles and functions, have proven invaluable in improving the fiduciary stewardship of the program. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
could I just ask Mr. Lyle where he is from?
I'm from Maine originally and spent a lot of time in Massachusetts.
Yep.
Yes.
You're pretty good with the R's, but Charge and card. I'm from Boston. We
Okay, yes,
struggle with those R's.
yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Lyle.
We don't have to bring in an interpreter, fortunately. You're accompanied by Mr. H.L. Larry, and Mr. Larry is Deputy Director of Air Force Services. Did you have an opening statement, sir? Yes.
Brief comment, sir.
Okay, then you're recognized. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Micah and Ranking Member Connolly, for the opportunity today as I respond to your questions regarding the purchase of espresso machines and accessories for Yokota Air Base in Japan. We appreciate the leadership and support the subcommittee continually provides on matters affecting the readiness and quality of life for our airmen and their families. And we remain vigilant to the need to continuously exercise tight fiscal stewardship of our scarce resources. Resource management in Air Force Services is somewhat unique because we are responsible for funds appropriated by the Congress as well as non-appropriated funds, or NAFs. NAFs are generated by morale, welfare, and recreation activities through sales and fees charged, such as the purchase of goods and services at our bowling centers, and by Air Force Services' share of the Army and Air Force Exchange Service dividends. In 2007, Air Force Services non-appropriated programs migrated from the government purchase card to the NAF purchase card to gain further manpower efficiencies and increased rebates. The NAF purchase card is used to make authorized NAF purchases for supplies and equipment. In regard to the inquiry into the purchase of espresso machines and accessories for Yokota Air Base in Japan, 4 espresso machines, along with accompanying accessories, were sourced using non-appropriated funds and installed at 2 non-appropriated activities, a base coffee shop and the Base Enlisted Club. This purchase was authorized and approved by the appropriate installation officials and executed by the local servicing contracting office in accordance with Air Force NAF contracting procedures. Pricing was determined fair and reasonable based on requirements and competition. We will continue to manage and monitor the use of non-appropriated funds generated throughout the Air Force and ensure these funds are properly used for all airmen and their families to enjoy. We look forward to your continued partnership in delivering the best quality of life to our airmen and their families. Again, Chairman Micah, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to working with you and the fellow subcommittee members, and I welcome any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll get right into the questions. Since you brought the subject up, Mr. Larry, about the Air Force base, I guess it was in Japan, where they purchased these 3 espresso machines for $8,000 apiece. Now, this was non-appropriated funds. That's what you're saying, none?
That is correct, sir.
Okay, because there was a press account. We get the accounts. Some of them are anecdotal press, and it raised everyone's eyebrows because $8,000. And that was at one location, but it was not taxpayer money. We want to make that clear. Was a card used and then paid back, or how did that work?
Yes, sir. From the non-appropriated fund side, we have warranted contracting specialists there at the installations, and they have certain dollar thresholds. In this case, when you combine all 4 of the machines of the purchase, it exceeded the NAF threshold. So we turned to our partners on the appropriated fund side who executed on behalf of non-appropriated funds.
Again, the press reports, we get them, and right now there are millions of Americans out there working hard, trying to pay their bills, put their kids through school, pay their taxes. And Mr. Connolly and I right now are trying to separate fact from fiction when it comes to some of the credit card gone wild stories that are out there. So yours is an example of where there was a legitimate expenditure. The press account was not correct, as I understand it. Is that right?
That is correct,
okay.
sir.
Again, we want the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and again, the proper expenditure of taxpayer dollars. But that brings me, okay, as long as we're on coffee, and we did espresso machines, you saw the Starbucks, and actually I buy, just for the record, I buy McDonald's, try to get the senior coffee or a dollar when it's on sale. This is more expensive, so no, I'm not promoting any product, Mr.
I'd like to do that too, but I'm too young, Mr. Chairman.
And you get free refills too at McDonald's. But in any event, that aside, again, I put up, we were absolutely startled, Ms. Richards, when we saw at one Starbucks in California, $12,000 worth of purchases. Are you aware that those purchases took place on the government credit cards?
Mr. Chairman, your staff shared the list of purchases that you had with us. We've begun to make some preliminary inquiries. We are going to include those transactions as a separate test in our
Yeah, but you have
audit.
not, well, again,
But-
we have from that one Starbucks credit card purchases of $12,000. And I don't begrudge Coast Guard people or DHS people of, where it's legitimate business and possibly buying some coffee for meetings, official meetings,
Chairman,
or guests.
The Coast
that come in.
Guard has provided some initial information for us on their look at those purchases, and many of those
You don't
purchases-
dispute what we have?
No.
Okay.
But what
And
we-
then the
but,
other thing, too,
Mr.
is we
Chairman-
found, in looking at other DHS entities, there was $31,000 that we found in Starbucks across the other entities. So, I mean, that just jumps out you 12,000, one California Starbucks location.
And the majority of those purchases were to furnish coffee for the dining pantries on board cutters for when they were operating at sea.
Well, there may be a very legitimate purchase requirement, but for the rest of DHS, it's $31,000 that we've been able to identify. So again, if you can document that, if it's justified, we don't begrudge.
And as I said, some of the purchases seem to be legitimate use of the card to supply the kitchens or galleys on board ships. We will be looking at all of those purchases that you provided to us, and as part of our audit, we will be looking for those types of purchases where the vendor's name, such
Right.
as this coffee shops, would jump out at you as something you would want
Right.
to look at.
Again, that jumped out 12 at one location. And we have, again, a wide variety of Coast Guard stations. In fact, my wife even had one of the Coast Guard cutters, the small ones, named after her. We're very proud of the Coast Guard and their service. But that kind of catches your eye. You did testify that we had $439 million in credit card purchases. Is that DHS-wide?
That is DHS-wide,
Okay.
sir.
And, okay, we have 3 Inspector General reports here, March for EPA of this year. That was Ms. Casper. Mr. Lewis was Department of Labor, April 2014. DHS is January, earlier this year, that are part of what we're reviewing here today. The other 2, well, in the EPA report, Ms. Casper, you testified, well, we calculated about half of the sample purchases, over half, there was something wrong, misuse, abuse, or not compliance. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And Mr. Lewis, you, in your testimony, you just testified that you found about 35% of the purchases with the credit card were abusive or non-compliant.
That was just with the prepaid debit cards.
Okay.
35%
Would you
prepaid.
guesstimate on credit cards? That was debit cards?
Well, the issues with the credit card, the travel cards themselves were actually cases where they should have been using the cards and were not, so we lost government airfare. We lost $400,000.
So you lost money there. But, okay, so what I'm trying to do is we have 50% abuse even with the new law, EPA, use of credit cards, debit cards or credit cards, at least 35% in your review. Okay, you have $439 million, almost $500 million, Ms. Richards, in DHS, you did not speak to what you found as like a percentage of abuse, but is it possible to calculate that, or of what you reviewed?
In 2013, we did a risk assessment because it was a follow-up from work we had published earlier. So we didn't test individual transactions in that audit. So I cannot at this time estimate any numbers of purchases that would have been inappropriate based on that work.
Well, again, we're sorting through some of those figures, and that's pretty, I mean, it's almost $500 million, and you said you had how many credit cards issued?
The department currently has about 9,700 purchase card users.
Okay. And, you know, there's poor management, poor control. Some of that was what you had stated that was identified. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, again, we'd have to assume that a significant number of those purchases were non-compliant. And I think you spoke about actually the lack of compliance or lack of training or whatever. Actually, it sounds like a lack of management or administrative oversight and education of employees that causes this. Is that what you found?
We've done a number of audits of this topic over the years, both my office and our Office of Emergency Management Oversight, as well as GAO. And we have found over the audits that we've done that there have been a lack of controls and a lack of oversight. But we've also seen the department take our recommendations and implement them. And so they are working hard to improve their internal control environment and their internal controls and oversight. That's why we did a risk assessment last year, and we're in the process of doing the full audit.
To get them to do that, have you published a manual, a set of guidelines? What is, what have you done? Is it meetings that you conduct on training?
We've published a number of reports.
Okay.
Prior to you're looking at our latest report from January 2014. We've published a number of reports, I believe, 2 in 13 and 1 in 12.
I have a copy of your report, but your report talks about some of the problems. It's sort of an audit or overview of what's going on. But is there a simple guideline that you publish for?
We don't publish a guideline for the department. That would be a management function. We've provided recommendations on what they should include in the guidelines they've published.
Have they published that to your satisfaction?
Yes, they have.
Okay. Again, we have some non-compliance at significant levels. Let me see, Mr. Lyle, was it you testified that we save about the Department of Defense, or at least the Air Force, you're speaking for Air Force, you calculate that you save about $70 per transaction by using the credit card, or I don't know if you use debit cards, but there's the, again, you don't have the paperwork, you don't have the administrative costs and all of that. Is that how you calculate that savings?
Yes, as opposed to traditional government contracting.
Yeah, and probably,
documents.
I just talked to one of my DOD contractors from my district who didn't have very kind words about federal defense contracting, but probably is one of the most difficult to proceed with. And so that's where you calculate $70 per transaction.
Correct.
And you have $1.2 billion worth of purchases with credit cards just at Air Force.
Just on the Air Force, yes.
So it's got to be huge dollars. I mean, we've gone from, you know, $12,000 worth of Starbucks purchases to 1.2, and you said 26,000 credit cards at the Air Force.
26,000 card holders, yes.
Okay. Why shouldn't DOD and the Air Force be subject to the same provisions of the 2012 law?
Well, I can't speak for the entire Department of Defense, but I know for the Air Force, we're very proud of our accomplishments in that system that I talked about during my brief summary. That's also included in my testimony, the Purchase Card Online program, PCOLS. and that system audits 100% of all transactions. And then 3% of the high-risk items that might have items like gym memberships or hair salons or things like that that are in the merchant's card code, if they pop up in this report, they'll flag a risk item, and then that'll require a manual insight or someone from either the cardholder supervisor, which is the approving official, or the agency, and the program coordinator will go in and look at each one of those transactions.
Do you conduct that, do you have a system that you've set up internally, or are you using a credit card company that does it for you?
That is a system that's been established within the Department of Defense, and the Director of Procurement and Acquisition Policy, that office administers the PCOL system across the Department
Is
of Defense.
that with a private contractor that operates it?
Sir, I have to take that question.
Probably
on the
would be.
record.
I don't think
believe
you
that
do.
it is. I believe that a private contractor established that system, and it rides right along with the GPC program. So is that correct? U.S. Bank. Okay, U.S. Bank provided that.
Okay.
Set it up with you.
Because I do know some of the bank credit card folks are incredible. I've had several instances where, in fact, I gave my credit card in American Express to buy sandwiches for staff one day. I don't spring that often, but somebody picked up the credit card number, and that was at lunchtime. By 7 o'clock, I was called by, this happened to be American Express, and they said that we've examined your purchases, and your wife usually doesn't spend $5,000 at Nordstrom's, and they had contacted me. They canceled the card immediately. So someone had gotten a number in 6-7 hours and was charging things. So you have that type of system that can kick out.
Yes, sir. What you're talking about, though, is a potential fraud abuse that someone unauthorized gets the card.
That's a little bit different, but you're using the same principles if the credit card has
correct
some aberration in purchase.
Aberration,
it kicks
risk
out.
items.
Do we have anything like that in DHS? You're a huge
I don't know that we have a specific program designed, but we do have the data, and they do data analytics on that data to identify those kinds of anomalies.
It'd be interesting to find out. Maybe we can ask the staff to pursue that. Might be, I don't know if your model is that good. We should also check that out, Mr. Lyle. But again, we need as many assurances that the cards aren't being abused, that they're properly used. And if there is some dramatic aberration in the use, and you have a system that kicks it out, that would be good that we mirror that in other agencies. She's not, DHS hasn't quite caught up with Air Force, but $500 million is, and again, if you have 20–30% of it, that's.
If I could just make one additional.
Yes, go right ahead, Mr. Lyle.
Of the 96% that are registered, the 4% is usually turnover. One person leaves, another person coming in. So we'll never achieve 100% of cardholders registered in the system, but we're very confident that we're doing very well. In fact, about 6 months earlier this year, we were down to about 91%. We put a big push within the Air Force because this is our best way to guard against fraud, waste, and abuse, and our commanders took this on, and we elevated our registration back up to the 96% leading DOD.
Well, we have some examples of DOD. My question was originally, would you have a problem if we put you under similar provisions? And we may have to revise some of them after this hearing, look at additional safeguards, but is there any reason that Air Force or DOD should be exempt?
Right, and I started to answer your question by saying that because of the internal controls that we do have already with the PCOLs, as well as the 30-day audits by the assessing officials, as well as by the area or agency and program coordinators, that's been working very well. About 0.45% of all of our transactions, we had I believe, and I'll go back to refresh my memory on the total number of 1.5 million transactions, I believe. But of those transactions, 0.45%, we had some potential risk violations. That's a total of about 1,910. Each one of those was reviewed, and we found that 26 resulted in UCMJ or civilian personnel actions that we'll have to take.
Okay. So you
We are finding
actually
them.
kick those, when they're kicked out, you do investigate
Yes.
every one of them and then take
Every
action.
single one of them, yes.
But that still doesn't answer my question as to whether you would object to being, yeah, I guess you can't speak from that policy.
I can't speak for the policy for the entire Department of Defense. I would have to take that for the record and ask DPAP, Director of Procurement
Okay.
and Acquisition Policy, to answer that. But from an Air Force perspective, I can see how that the act that you passed is definitely something that's viable and worthwhile, and we'd look at it and see how it might apply
Well,
to the Air
it
Force.
has had some successes. We heard the Department of Labor, but we still have obvious, I don't want to say rampant abuse, but significant abuse. And we don't have credit cards, government credit cards gone wild, tamed yet. With that, I have more questions, but let me yield to Mr. Conley, who's been waiting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Larry, I want to make sure I followed your answer to the question of the $25,000 espresso machines. You said that they were purchased with unappropriated funds. Is that correct?
Correct, sir.
What are unappropriated funds?
Sir, we call them a non-appropriated fund. These are the funds on the base. You run a golf course or a bowling center. When you go in and you buy a hamburger, you play around a golf, you bowl a line of bowling, the dollars that that airman or that family member take out of his or her pocket and pay for that good or service on the spot, those are non-appropriated fund dollars.
Generated by those activities?
Yes, sir.
Were government-issued purchase cards or debit cards used for that acquisition?
No, sir.
Okay. That's what I wanted to know. Let me ask our IGs. Is it ever permissible to use a government-issued purchase card, debit card, or the like for a hair salon session, gym membership, personal gym membership, or personal gift cards? Ms. Casper.
Hair salons, we didn't have it in our transactions, but we did do some research on the idea of gym membership, and there is a Comptroller General decision that says in some circumstances it is permissible to purchase gym memberships if it's part of some health and welfare program.
Authorized by your employer.
Right.
Right.
Obviously, it's not
But let's
acceptable-
put that aside for a minute. Let me reframe the question. Is it ever permissible to go to a hair salon or your personal gym unrelated to that exemption for you or your family, or to purchase gift cards in using a government-issued debit card, purchase card, credit card?
Not unless it has a government-associated use and approved use.
And are the policies you look at EPA explicit about that prohibition?
They are not explicit about the prohibition.
They are not?
Right. That was part of our recommendation in the report, is that they be more explicit about the issues of gym memberships and gift cards, that EPA needed to improve its internal controls there. EPA is in the process of improving their policies in that area, but they have not completed their policies in that area.
That doesn't sound complicated. I mean,
Yeah.
what goes through one's mind if you're a federal employee and you got a federally issued credit card and you decide, you know, I need groceries tonight? Why not just put it on the government card? I mean, I'm not saying anyone has ever done that, but clearly some alarm bell ought to go off in your head. That's not a proper use of a government-issued credit card.
Normally, you would expect most people to think that, but there are apparently people out there that think, do you know what, no one's looking at this. Let me
Well,
use this.
temptation is a different issue. That's right. Mr. Liu, and I look forward to the EPA's explicit prohibition. It is amazing to me, Mr. Chairman, they don't have one. But, Mr. Lewis, what about the Department of Labor? Is it ever permitted? Same question.
I I can't think of a case where it would be permitted. It would be very narrow. As Ms. Casper said, there would have to be some nexus to government business in order to do that.
Right.
And I don't know what that would be in the Department of Labor.
I suppose if you were the Department of Labor Employee of the Year and you were going to meet Queen Elizabeth, we might say, yeah, get your hair done. But other than that, I can't think of an exemption for a hair salon. Can you?
No.
Are the policies at DOL, Department of Labor, explicit in this prohibition?
Well, we currently have an audit looking at the general purchase cards across the department. So we're still looking at how well that's done. In terms of this audit,
No, that's not my question. Is there an explicit prohibition in the Department of Labor's own policy saying you can't use credit cards for those purposes?
I do not know exactly what the policy says for the purchase cards in general in the department. That's what we're currently looking at. For what we have looked at in the Job Corps program, it was explicit as to what you could use the cards for. And there were, in this case, there were only 2 uses, which was
But not explicit in prohibited activities?
no. Explicit in terms of
You know,
only things.
In my
that
life,
use-
I often will be engaged in various and sundry things, and the question that always comes to mind that you ought to ask is what could go wrong with that? So not having an explicit, thou may not
Yes.
use it for personal purposes, I don't understand what's hard about that, but it's astounding to me they didn't have one.
Well, I think that's important, like I said, in the general purchase card program. In the case of these debit cards where there were only 2 uses, baggage fees when traveling, students are traveling, and the allowance they give them for meals while traveling.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's very easy to stipulate there are only 2 uses. You don't need to stipulate all the things you should not use it for.
Ms. Richards,
So
the Department of Homeland Security.
I can't think of an instance where those purchases would be appropriate, but again, you'd have to look at the individual purchase to see if there was a nexus to government services.
Well, assuming there wasn't, though, my
but-
question is predicated on, no, there's
Right.
no nexus,
The-
this is personal.
The Department of Homeland Security's regulations do state that government purchase cards are to be used for government business only and not for personal business.
So you have an
They-
explicit prohibition.
We don't have an explicit prohibition naming those items.
No.
Just an explicit prohibition of personal
Right,
use.
that guidance.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Lyle, understanding that you can't speak for policy for the Air Force, we understand that, but can you think of a reason why we wouldn't want to include the Pentagon and by extension the Air Force in a government-wide consistent set of standards and enforcement mechanisms and standard operating procedures with respect to the use of such cards, especially since you are, by far, the biggest user?
Yes, Department of Defense is the largest user of government purchase cards, and with the Air Force, I mean, I can speak for policy for the Air Force, just not for the Department of Defense, and as you know, we are part of Office of Secretary of Defense, Director of Procurement and Acquisition Policy. They set the policy for all of OSD. But as far from an Air Force perspective, the internal controls that I mentioned earlier, as far as the peak holes, and I'm not saying that these internal controls would obviate or would not need the Government Control Act as far as the transaction, as far as the Government Charge Card Prevention Act. I'm not saying that we wouldn't benefit from that act, but I can just tell you a little bit about our internal control process that we have now. In addition to the peak holes, we have 6 levels of control. We also have a separation of function, a requiring organization or a person that has a need, the card holder, and then the payer. And no one person can have all 3 of those functions and responsibilities and have one person to prevent those kind of frauds. And the only way that that could happen is that all 3 people would have to be in collusion together to be able to execute a fraudulent type action of that caliber. But it's not to say that it's not impossible. So whether or not the Card Prevention Act would prevent that, that's something that we could certainly look at. And as far as those 6 levels, I was talking about the agency or the program coordinator does monthly reviews of every transaction and, excuse me, an annual review of every transaction, but the approval official of the cardholder looks at every single transaction. Once again, the separation of power and control and functions so that no one person has all authority and control over the card.
Has the Air Force IG audited the use of these purchase cards for you?
Yes, the Air Force Audit Agency has. I'm not aware of the IG looking at these particular cards. They usually refer that to the Air Force contracting organization if they suspect or if anyone reports a problem with a government purchase card. They refer those issues.
It's just that when you're spending $1.2 billion
Right.
with 26,000 purchase cards in distribution in just the Air Force,
Right.
it's hard to believe that there hasn't been some misuse.
As I mentioned earlier, we've documented 26 actions out of those 1.5 million.
But you've heard the
transactions.
statistics here today.
Yes.
That would put you at radical variance from other federal agencies in the civilian sector.
Yes, that's not to say that we don't have abuses of the card or misuse of the card, fraud abuses, and we know about every single one of them, and we do a check on those particular
Well,
issues.
if your numbers are accurate, then maybe we need to have the U.S. Air Force take over the issuance of all federal credit cards, debit cards.
Sir, if you
purchase
give us the
cards.
resources, we'll be glad to do that.
Yeah, we'll transfer some of that management money. I mean, because that's quite a record, Mr. Lyle. Quite
We're
a
very
record.
proud of our accomplishments. I'm not aware of any fraudulent issues other than the 26 I mentioned. I don't know exactly what each and every one of those are, but I am very proud of the accomplishments of the government cardholders.
Again, if the numbers you cite are accurate, you should be.
Sir, I have no reason to believe they aren't.
Let me ask again our three IGs, excuse me. Are there two questions a layman might ask? Are there just too many cards in circulation for us to really get our arms around it, holding in abeyance Mr. Lyle's testimony? And are there too many employees authorized to use such purchase cards? Should those numbers be more manageable and more controlled in terms of number?
Within EPA, they do.
I can't hear you, Ms. Castro.
Within EPA, they do conduct an annual review to make sure we've got the right number of people with purchase cards. The idea is also that they be at the local level and that they be supervised locally. Whether or not, was it 2,000 employees is the right number, I can't really say at this point.
Well, how many employees are there in EPA total?
16,000.
So what if I said everyone who's an employee, when you become an employee of the EPA, we're going to issue one of these cards to you because you might need it. And, you know, they're working so well, why not have everybody have one? What would be wrong with that?
It would be wrong because you'd have to have quite a few controls.
Well, that's my
over
point.
that.
Do we have any idea about what is an optimum number versus that's too many? That's what I'm trying to get at. I mean, you withhold judgment on 2,000, but you exercise judgment on 16,000. So
I'm not aware what the optimal number is, and I'm also not aware that EPA knows what the optimal.
well, when you looked at this problem, was it your impression that the EPA is challenged with managing this number of cards issued to this number of people? Is that beyond their management skill, or do you think it's just right?
EPA was challenged in managing that number because they left it up to each of the approving officials to come up with their own standard operating procedures. And that resulted in a lot of variance across
Yeah, because
the
there's a lack of uniformity in standard setting. Well, that doesn't sound like...
One of the things EPA has done, based on the audit report, is now implemented standard operating procedures that will be instituted across the agency in the hopes of trying to level things out and institute more controls.
Well, that's a novel thought. I mean, I worked for a very large company with 45,000 employees. When credit cards were issued, there was a standard policy company-wide. We didn't just leave it up to local managers to decide how a credit card could be used or when it would be issued or to whom. We had standards, and it worked for a very large worldwide company.
Yes.
Mr. Lewis, you indicated in your testimony that 98 of 104 centers, job centers, had improper travel purchases. Is that correct?
Correct.
Ms. Richards had a piece of testimony where she said she thinks the problem in DHS is not with the design of standards, it's with the enforcement of those standards. Correct?
Yes, sir.
How would you characterize it in the Department of Labor? Do you think the design of standards is satisfactory or even exemplary, or is there a problem with the design of standards itself?
Well, in this particular instance, I think it's the design of the standards or lack of design, as well as enforcement or oversight over these. But again, this is a very, I guess, kind of narrow and unique issue within the Job Corps program. They utilize these debit cards. And in answer to your previous question, I think the conclusion in this case was that one debit card was too many debit cards. There are such small individual purchases that were being handled in this manner that even if you put all the controls in place to ensure that purchases were proper, it would cost a lot more to administer that than it would be worth. The department was buying, or the Job Corps centers were purchasing these cards ranged in value from $10 to $60. They paid $6 a piece for a card. So a $10 debit card cost them $16. So no matter how you administer that, it was not going to be an effective tool. And the fact that they had so many of these debit cards on hand made it much more tempting to people to misuse them. So they have switched to either using the travel cards, which were available to pay for some of these expenses, or the very smallest things, such as a $5 meal allowance. It would just be best to give the student cash for that rather than pay an additional $6 to provide a debit card.
Exactly. And my final question, Ms. Richards, it's my understanding that your office has issued 3 previous reports on the Department's use of purchase cards since 2010. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Each report contained recommendations. Has the agency, has the Department of Homeland Security acted on those previous recommendations?
Yes, sir, they have. I would have to get back to you with a list of the specific actions they've taken to each one of those recommendations.
Yeah, I would like to
Generally
see that
have.
because obviously we don't want to see recommendations ignored, and it tells us something here in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee when an agency is making a good faith effort to comply with recommendations from the IG.
Yes,
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. A couple of questions. Well, first, Ms. Richards, we were looking through your testimony and then your report, and it said you reported, is this 925 million purchases totaling $439 million. That's in the testimony
That's from 2013.
for 1 year. But when you divide that up, it comes up to about 50 cents per transaction. Are we missing, is that correct?
So those are the numbers that I have.
But it
Some
doesn't-
transactions are smaller than others.
An average of 50 cents a transaction?
That average doesn't sound probable. I would have to get back to you.
We don't think that these records, I mean, something's missing here. I just don't think that's accurate, but you repeated that in your testimony.
Those are the numbers that I have.
Yes.
Those are department-reported numbers. We did not.
And that's the report we have, too.
Right.
But again, something doesn't make sense there, if you could check that.
Yes.
And we will be leaving the record open for a period of 2 weeks without objection, so ordered. So we will have additional questions we'll be submitting after this. Okay, the 2012 law allowed, and Air Force is out and not under this, but 2012 law allowed employees to be fired, dismissed, terminated, prosecuted Can you tell us, Ms. Casper, EPA, how many that you know of terminated, disciplined, or prosecuted?
We recommended in our report that EPA take action. EPA was supposed to be taking action by September 30th. We haven't done the follow-up review yet for those actions.
Do you know of any?
No, I am not aware of any.
Okay. Could you check that and all?
Yes.
Mr.?
Would the Chair yield?
Yes, oh, yeah.
When you say take action, does that include, and if so, how many referrals for prosecution?
That could potentially be among the actions that they could take.
But you didn't make that recommendation,
No, we just said that they take the appropriate action among.
leaving it up to them to.
Right.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, again, we can pass a law, but the law has to be enforced, and there has to be consequences. Remember, I had Rudy Giuliani here years ago when he became mayor of New York. I think I chaired criminal justice drug policy. And I was fascinated by his zero tolerance. Man, they threw the book at you. And New York today has the residual effect of the zero tolerance policy. People, were taken to task, prosecuted, gone after. But we passed the 2012 law. We put tools in it. EPA can't cite anyone. Labor. Mr. Lewis, you had cited several. Were there others? I mean, that was in the Miami instance. Terminated, anyone prosecuted or disciplined?
To my knowledge, there's no one prosecuted, but I'd have to get back to you on that.
We'd like to.
I don't have the
know
latest
because
information. We did refer
Yeah.
all the instances we found in the Job Corps audit to our
Yeah.
investigators. But to my current knowledge is that no one was actually prosecuted. I'm not aware of any departmental employee that's been fired since this law has been in place for such actions. I think in this case, these were contractor employees, and so they already had more latitude in terms of addressing that than we would have had in the past with the federal employees.
just for the record, I have to put this in, Mr. Conley. In my own area in Central Florida, I had a housing authority and a director who came in after I had gotten the housing authority taken over by HUD. It was so mismanaged, they brought in another housing authority director. Actually, when I came to office, the first thing was a housing authority director coming to me complaining that the state attorney was going after her, and part of it was credit card abuses, making false payments, and asked me to weigh in for it. I asked her to find the door because the list of charges were just incredible. I remember that. So then I go back to having HUD take over the same housing authority. They put in another housing director who, when I found out about his reputation, tried not to get him appointed. Washington overrode me, Atlanta overrode me, Jacksonville. They hired him, and we had spent millions to bring the thing back up, turned it back over. HUD took control, and within 7, 8 years, he ran it down. I think there were thousands of dollars of credit card abuses. And I wish I'd remembered this before we did this hearing today. I should have had HUD in here. But HUD investigated, the IG made a criminal referral to the Department of Justice, and they never, we asked Justice, they never pursued it. So we have agencies who are abusing, some employees who are abusing the public trust, and we have some mechanisms to go after them. And then I was just stunned. The Department of Justice refused to go after them. If you'd gone in with a mask and a gun held up and taken 10% of what was gone. But again, I just have to recall that for the record. Ms. Richards, you're next. Anyone prosecuted, terminated, or disciplined in DHS?
Sir, I'm aware that some employees have been disciplined and terminated for credit card abuse. But at DHS, those records would not be managed centrally, so I would not have the ability to get the scope of all the actions that might have been taken.
Well, if you could review that, let us know for the record, too. We're leaving that open. We passed a law in 2012 to try to be better stewards of public money. We can save money. The Air Force has cited in testimony that you can save money by using these for small transactions. And there are a lot of benefit, but there are also a lot of abuses. EPA today, about half of the sampling abused. Labor, 35% on the debit cards. DHS, so she hasn't come totally clean with us, but we'll get the information one way or the other. We have our methods, Ms. Richards, extracting the information, but just teasing, just teasing. We are relying on you to report to us. Again, we would like to kind of get a better handle on what is taking place. And if the law needs, and my last question, too, to each of you, is any recommendations for tightening up the law? This is interesting because some of it is poor management practices or poor administration. Some is not having the proper protocols in place that are sort of standard and can take the law to implementation with better understanding and performance and compliance by Federal employees. But tell us, if you can, if there's any tool missing or anything we can do. The other thing, too, is OMB should possibly have some role in this, or requiring at least that an agency come up with some set of protocols that are missing in some of the agencies or compliance. So, Ms. Casper, any recommendations for myself, Mr. Conley of the committee?
The law contains many of the controls that are necessary, and almost all the controls that are necessary regarding purchase cards. The issue at EPA was not overseeing to make sure that those actual controls were being implemented.
Again, like Ms. Richards said, lack of compliance.
Right.
Okay. And we might look at some mechanism to ensure that. Mr. Lewis?
We haven't found anything that we believe would require legislation to address. Ours as well was simply a case of, just a complete lack of oversight or attention to this. And the requirements are already there for that to be in place. The focus that this act has put on the periodic risk assessments and audits, I think, has been good, and that is working to start bringing these things.
Well, and you have cited some successes and bringing about compliance, and also implementing the intent and purpose of the law. And Mr. Lyle with the Air Force has cited what they've done to try to again, get the proper use of these cards. Ms. Richards, any changes, anything you see we need to do from the law or procedural standpoint?
No, sir, not at this time. The law very wisely puts in place the regular risk assessments and reporting to the OIGs and the requirements for us to take a look back at what the departments are doing. And I think as that plays out over time, it will better inform any changes you might have to make in the future.
Okay. Mr. Conley, did you have something?
Yeah, could I just follow up on that, Mr. Chairman? First of all, I'll answer your question. Certainly one thing that came out of this hearing for me is we need an explicit prohibition on the personal use of these cards, period. There cannot be any circumstance of un-job-related use of a credit card that's issued by the government. That is wrong, and we ought to make it an explicit prohibition, it seems to me. And it ought to be required of every Federal agency that issues such cards. Anyway, that would be certainly one thing I'd answer to your question in terms of how we might update the law. Other than that, I'm glad to hear the 2012 law is helpful.
Does OMB enforce the law or put out any guidelines? Is that their role? I'm not sure.
Could be.
They're the fiscal. Sure. Ms. Casper, Ms. Lewis, Mr.
OMB put out a circular A123, and I think it's Appendix B of that circular. I think it was updated based to comply with the new law,
You mean the 2012
The
law?
2012 law.
or the 2012.
And do you think that's adequate? I'm not aware of the provisions.
I'm
You can look-
not aware that there's any issues or problems.
Okay. Mr. Lewis, anything?
No, that's correct. They have put out some guidance, and they are publishing reports where they're collecting information from the departments and the IGs on, what issues we're identifying with purchase cards and the status of recommendations.
Ms. Richards?
I agree with my fellow assistant IGs that the OMB has put out additional guidance, and they are following up on publishing the results from the
But they
OIGs.
really don't go back that much to check. Have you seen them, any compliance of their?
OMB puts out the guidance, and it's up to the individual departments to enforce
Okay.
it.
And you all oversee some of that as inspector generals?
Mr. Chairman, the only thing that strikes me here, though, correct me if I'm wrong, but in a sense, neither the 2012 law nor the OMB guidance give explicit guidance for criteria of who gets a card and when can a card be used. Would that be fair? Because if I understood you, Ms. Casper, you were saying even within EPA, there was kind of broad discretion about that guidance. So that would suggest there isn't government-wide guidance.
I'm not aware of any guidance as to who can get it or how many can be distributed.
And both Mr. Lewis and Ms. Richards would agree with that?
Same here.
Yeah.
In our current audit, we are looking at the utilization of these cards because we know some people have them and they don't use them. So
Yeah.
evidently, they do not need them.
We're also looking at it, and it's a matter of, in the Department of Homeland Security, because we're geographically widely dispersed, you would want to have a card available at a location, but you may not need two cards. So that's one of the ways we're looking at it, to make
Yeah.
sure they've minimized the number of cards out there.
And that's always a challenge for us up here, too. You don't want to codify things like guidance and unwittingly make it impossible to achieve the savings and the efficiencies such cards can provide. On the other hand, the absence of any guidance does allow for, even within an agency, a myriad of standards that can lead to misuse, deliberate and non-deliberate. And obviously, that is of concern to us. So I would echo the Chairman's invitation to all of you to, if you, upon reflection, upon this hearing, if you've got suggestions for how we might improve the law, we would certainly welcome them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing.
Thank you. Well, one final thing. I'm a renowned tightwad, and I try to get as much for my buck, whether it's the taxpayer's buck or my own. Just out of curiosity, like I use several cards. You get a cash back with one. Do we, any of you have any detail in negotiating with these? Do we get, because again, right now the Federal Government's broke. We're borrowing 40 cents on every dollar, something in that range. So our job is not only to see that waste, fraud, and abuse is eliminated, but the maximum revenue we can get in, the least going out. Mr. Lyle, you're shaking your head yes. Have you got found some good return for the
Yes.
government and the
In
taxpayer?
addition to the transaction savings that we discussed earlier, we did receive $14.7 million in rebates this past year. We're also increasing the use on the government purchase card above the micro-purchase threshold for pre-established contract instruments that are pre-priced, so that it will protect the taxpayers' dollars from that perspective. We wouldn't want government purchase card holders to go out to negotiate contracts per se, but if it's pre-priced, we're going to increase the use of the card up to the simplified acquisition threshold, $150,000, to take advantage of that transaction savings as well as the rebates. That's what we're really going after, is those rebates from U.S. Bank.
Okay. Ms. Richards, DHS 2012-2013, $2.6 billion in credit card purchases. Just heard the success story of Air Force. Are you familiar with any savings?
I don't have the dollar figures available, but the department does receive a rebate when they use the purchase card.
Could you also make that part of the record?
I will, sir.
Again, we're looking for waste, fraud, and abuse, but we're also looking for savings. Mr. Lewis and Ms. Casper?
Same as Ms. Richard, I know there are rebates, but I do not know the dollar
Okay.
amount for labor.
Ms. Casper?
I also know there are rebates. They get rebates depending on how fast they approve the purchase to be paid, but I don't know exactly
Okay.
what the amount of rebates was
Well,
during last year.
again, this is a small sampling of federal agencies, and we appreciate your cooperation. We're looking to see how a law we passed in 2012 worked. There are a number of IG reports dating back to January of this year and subsequent reports that we've reviewed for this hearing. Pleased that each of you would take time to come in today. Where our job is, again, to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, and yours are too, particularly the Inspector General, as well all of us as federal employees. Any closing comments, Mr.? I thank Mr. Conley again and the staff for working during this particular time frame to make certain we did this. I think we've done a record number of hearings. Appreciate your